everyone and welcome back to the Analyst dated 8th of March 2024, which is a good day to have a deeper analysis of the following current affair articles taken from the Hindu and Indian Express. To begin with, we will analyze the steel industry of India and the challenges faced by it. Then, we will explore what is TB disease and how it particularly affects the homeless women in India. In the third topic, we'll read about the man-wildlife conflict as Kerala becomes the first state in India to declare it as a state disaster. And then we will understand what are active pharmaceutical ingredients and how India performs in its production. And finally, we will wind up the discussion with a reading of El-Nino and the impact on Indian monsoon. So let's get started. So in the first topic, we will analyze the steel sector of India. The current context is that with imports from China and Vietnam rising since last October, it has been seen that India will now get converted into a net importer of steel, which makes us to analyze what are the steel industry prospects, challenges and way forward for us. This is more so important because it corresponds with multiple aspects of UPSC syllabus. In the GS1, you have to read about minerals and energy resources. In GS3, you have to read about the industrial growth and development. And in GS2, we study about the related government policies and intervention. So because this particular topic is in the confluence of all these three parts of syllabus, it becomes more important for us. So first of all, let's understand what is steel and why is it important for the economy. So steel is an alloy of iron. Iron, when mixed with carbon, makes steel, which provides it more resilience and also provide it more strength as compared to iron. Now, when added with a certain amount of chromium, about 11% of chromium, this becomes stainless steel. Now, because of the varied applications and forward and backward linkages of steel across the economy, it also becomes the backbone of modern industrialization. So our industries and economies are actually led by and driven by steel. That is why it's very important for us to study. India particularly performs very well in steel, where it stands as the second top producer of steel in the world, surpassing Japan, and it is only after China. So it is world's second largest producer of crude steel, and it contributes to 2% in the total GDP share of India. If you talk about the growth, that is also rising enormously. The production has risen up to 75% in the last 10 years. So that is also welcoming news for us. Now, the major steel industries in India, as you can see, are majorly located in the coal fields, in and around the coal field. Coal is actually one of the raw materials, and iron and coal, both of them are the important raw materials for the steel industry. So the steel and iron industry are also located near the coal fields or the iron mines. So the major producer or the largest producer of steel in India is Odisha, followed by Jharkhand and followed by Chhattisgarh. Now, if you talk about the first ever, the commencement of the steel plant in India, it happened in the year 1907 with the setting up of Tisco plant in Jamshedpur, Jharkhand. So, Jamshedpur was the first steel plant of India. Then, I'm talking about the colonial times only. Then in 1919, there was the establishment of ISCO in the Burnpur of West Bengal. Then in 1923, again happening in the colonial times, we set up the Bhadravati or the Vishveshwarya steel plant in Karnataka. So these three steel plants were there in the colonial times. Now when we enter into the independent India phase, we'll analyze the growth of steel industry thereby. First of all, in the first decade, it saw a relatively slower growth. Why? Because the installed industries were not having that much production capacity. That is the first thing. Second, there was low capital also at that time. It was also seen that the capacity was low. It was also seen that the new PSUs were yet to start the production in this phase. They were not commenced till now because the steel industry was not a major issue or a major thing that was taken up by the first 5-year plan. And then there was also low demand of the finished products of the steel industry because the industrial development in this period in India was also fairly poor. So if there is no industry, then where would the steel be demanded for? So therefore, the first decade saw relatively slower growth. Now the second decade saw the exponential growth with the coming up of second 5-year plan, which led to establishment of 3 very important steel and iron plants in India. These were in Bhilai, Durgapur and Rourkela plants. Now upon this, it was seen that the per capita income of the country also drastically increased because of the setting up of iron and steel industry, because they also led to, again, it affirmed, it augmented the backward and the forward linkages, which means it increased the demand of coal and other raw materials in India. It also increased the employment in India. It also led to establishment of industrial clusters in India, and it also increased the standard of living, especially of the people living in these industrial clusters, which were led by the iron and steel industry. So the second phase saw exponential growth. Talking about the third phase, which is actually the 1991, post 1991 reforms. What happened in 1991? The LPG reforms occurred, the liberalization reforms, which basically benefited which sector? The service sector. Because now, after liberalization, tertiary sector or the service sector gained the momentum or fillip in India. What compromised? The steel sector or the manufacturing sector compromised, leading to the losses of steel generating public sector enterprises. So now it became in loss. And it also now started attracting competition from abroad, as it became more capital intensive and it became a loss making industry in India. So we started importing steel more after the post liberalization reforms. And in fact, in this particular news also, it has been suggested that we will now be becoming the net finished steel importer in this particular year. So then, why is it that a top producer like India is also getting converted into a net importer of India? It is because of certain challenges faced by the Indian steel industry. What are these? First of all, the industries incur a very high production cost. The production cost is high because of overtly dependence on the raw material. What are the two raw materials required? We need coking coal. We need high grade coking coal, and we also need to have high grade iron ore in order to produce high grade steels in India. What happens is the reserves of coking coal in India are limited. Again, the sufficient amount and the good quality of iron ore grade is again limited in India. Though we have vast reserves of both of them, but now they are getting depleted. And second, because of the environmental concerns, people are converting into more greener form of steel industries. And also we can see that the quality is also less as compared to other parts of the world. So because of this, the input cost increases. Because the input cost increases, the overall production cost in India also increases. Next, it is a capital and labor intensive industries. It requires skilled laborers in large amount, and it also requires large amount of capital. According to PwC report, it was seen that in order to generate a industry capacity that is able to produce 1 tons of steel, do you know how much amount of investment is required? Over and about 7,000 crore rupees in order to just produce 1 tons of steel. So it is a very intensive industry in terms of capital and labor. Then it also leads to delayed returns on the investment. Even if somebody takes the courage to invest so highly in these industries, the returns are often delayed. The reason is the variability in the demand. The demand can slump or the demand can grow in about inevitable time, and therefore it leads to delayed returns or unpromisable returns on the investment. You never know when the demand will slump. Anyway, the producer is producing it in bulk, so its price will heavily be dependent on two things. First of all, the competitive prices offered across the world, for example, China, Japan, etc. And then second, that how much is the global demand of steel and what is the competitiveness of Indian prices across the world. So therefore, delayed returns on investment. Next, and this is very important factor, that in India we have lower domestic demand of steel itself. In fact, it is said that the per capita demand of the steel actually is directly proportional to the amount of industrialization a country is going on through. So because of the lower per capita consumption of steel in India, which is only of about 75 kgs per capita, which is, if you talk about China, it is having a per capita consumption of a whooping 500 kgs. So because here the domestic demand is also very high, so it becomes lucrative for the producers to produce steel in bulk amount, whereas this is not the same in India. In order to deal with this issue, the National Steel Policy of 2017 aims to double up this per capita consumption to about 160 kgs by the year 2030. Now, the other concern is about the environmental concerns. This is one of the highly energy intensive sector only after the chemical industry. If you talk about the raw inputs that it takes, it's mostly driven by the coal, and coal is having very high carbon footprint. Naturally, it is not good for environment, and therefore it attracts many environmental regulations. Now, the companies or the industries that are already laid down, they also need to put up some of the augmentations like precipitators, which again is a costly affair. So therefore, again enhancing the capital investment required for this industry. So it attracts environmental regulation. Next, we talk about the logistic and the transportation, which is very important aspect. See, not everything is located nearby. Steel industry is made up of multiple raw materials, and according to the Weber's industrial model, if you have known about it, then steel industry is located more closer to the raw materials like coal and iron as compared to the market. Its position is somewhere between here. Why? Because both of them are bulk reducing, they are weight losing components, and therefore transporting them would be a costly affair again. But then, as you know, that there are limited fields of iron and coal in India, and they are already clustered by the industries and the industrial clusters. So in order to establish industries, steel and iron industries in other parts of the India, what we require proper efficient logistic support. In India currently, it is rather poor. The ports are often congested, and also the railway lines are not expanded well enough. So therefore, it becomes very expensive to carry out the transportation of raw material to the desired industrial places. Next, there is gap in the production of specialty steel grade. Another very important challenge you need to understand. See, the kind of steel that India produces is known as the bulk grade. Now, this is not as good quality as that which is required by current industrial revolution, which is driven by automobiles like electric vehicles or some of the big data servers, which again need specialty steel. So the demand right now is not the bulk grade steel, but the specialty steel. So I hope you understand that. In India in particular, does not produces enough quantity of specialty grade steel. Again, why? Because it is less remunerative for the industrialist to produce it. Now that we understand the challenges, we will talk about what we can do to strengthen and bolster the steel sector in India to drive our economy further. It's a great multiplier, we know this. So first of all, we need to focus more on production of the steel which is in demand globally, that is the specialty steel. And for this, Government of India has launched the production linked incentive scheme, where it will be given a 5-year grant to the manufacturers of the specialty grade steel, and they will be incentivized for their incremental sales. So the scheme is PLI for promoting the specialty steel. The second, if we want to deal with the environmental concerns and balance it with the industrial development, what do we need? We need to decarbonize the industry. How do we decarbonize? First of all, the energy, the raw material that feeds it is highly carbon intensive, that is coal. So we can replace coal with a greener form of energy, let's say green hydrogen. So the green hydrogen mission can come to the rescue. So we can augment the green hydrogen mission with the national steel policy in order to decarbonize the steel sector. So first of all, we can put green energy. Second, we can also introduce some of the best techniques for the adoption of modernization. So for example, some of the precipitators can be augmented so that the pollutants can be filtered out before they are released into the environment. Also, technologies like carbon capture, utilization and storage can also be incorporated, and government should incentivize the industries to promote it or to incorporate it in their industries. Now, next is streamlining the logistics. This is the need of the hour, where we'll try to expand the railway networks, we'll try to decongest our ports by, let's say, the Sagarmala program. We will also try to expand the inland waterways using inland waterways, for example the Ganga system, the Yamuna system, etc., for inland transportation, because it is much more cheaper as compared to the other modes of transportation like roads and railways. And we also need to provide a multimodal connectivity across all these different modes, and this can be done via PM Gati Shakti mission. Then we also need to increase the domestic demand by increasing the per capita requirement. This can be done by providing industrialization or promoting industrialization that feeds on the steel industry of India. And to enable that, the National Steel Policy has already made a target to increase it by twofold from current 75 kgs of per capita consumption to 160. This will also denote that India has reached a higher level or has mobilized to a higher level of industrialization. And finally, the problem is that we do not have enough raw material, or we do not have adequate quality of raw material with us that can produce good quality steel. So we can recycle the existing material, existing ferrous scraps that we can get from the end of life cycle vehicles, and that scrap steel can be used as an input for many of the plants to again generate steel. So recycling of the scrap steel can also be a good solution in this regard. This will also give rise to what we know as the circular economy, where the waste is leading to the input again. And this is incorporated by the Government of India under the Steel Scrap Recycling Policy of 2019. So this is how we will be able to enforce, we will be able to augment and strengthen the steel sector of India, and therefore give impetus to the Indian economy. Now our next topic is about a very good analysis on the correlation of women and tuberculosis disease. So this particular, on the occasion of International Women Day, this particular section of the Hindu provides us an analysis on how the homeless women in India are facing the most terrible predicament, that is, how to manage the economic and clinical challenges of the TB disease. It again corresponds to multiple parts of the syllabus. In the GS2, you have social justice, you have health and education, and in GS3, you will be studying about the communicable disease, which is tuberculosis. So first of all, what is this disease of tuberculosis and why is it so detrimental for India? So first of all, tuberculosis is an infectious disease which is caused by a bacteria. So this is a bacterial disease which is infectious, meaning that it can be transferred. It is contagious, it can be transferred from one body to another. Now, it is caused by a bacteria which is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which mostly affects, not all the time, but it mostly affects the lungs of the body. Now, depending upon how many parts of body does it affects, TB disease can be broadly classified into two types of TB. One is the pulmonary TB, that which affects the lungs. And the second classification is the extrapulmonary TB, that which affects other body parts, for example, lymphatic system or brain or kidney or skin, etc. Most of the times, there is high occurrence of its infection in the lungs. Therefore, we generally associate it as a lung disease. But if a statement comes to you in the prelims examination that it can also infect the brain, the bones and the lymphatic system, that statement will also not be wrong. So this is the first classification. The second classification is based on its spreadability, whether it can be transmitted from one person to another. See, this concept also needs to be made clear that not all kinds of TB are transmissible. Yes, it is a contagion disease, but not every type of TB is contagion. So, on the basis of the amount of and the level of spreadability, it can be further divided into latent TB or hidden TB and the active TB disease. This is active TB. Latent TB means that the TB bacteria are inside the lungs, are present, but they are not growing. If they are not growing, they can't spread within the lung or cannot spread from person to person. So such latent TB does not show any symptom inside the body. Whereas the active TB, because here you will see the multiplication of the bacterial growth inside the lung, it is spreading in the lung, therefore the active TB will show enough amount of symptoms. That's the first classification. Second thing is whether it is spreading to another person or not. If the latent TB is not spreading inside the lung, then how will it spread to another person? So it doesn't spread from person to person, whereas the active TB spreads from person to person. So here we have read about what is TB and what are its two classifications, and I hope it is clear to you. When we talk about India, India bears the highest global burden of the TB disease in the world, with about 27% of the total population suffering from this disease. It actually also faces high fatality when it comes to TB disease. So people dying out of TB are also to this data, which suggests that there are about 2 deaths in every 3 minutes caused by the TB disease. It is more grave when it comes to women, according to a joint report of the Registrar General of India and the Center of Global Health Research. It says that it is the fifth leading cause of the fatality or mortality in the women. So again, we need to study in-depth correlation between why it majorly and mostly affects women in India and why they are more susceptible to the fatalities caused by it. Now, how it affects women more than men. Generally, TB is considered as a men's disease. But this is a fallacy. This is a wrong fallacy which needs to be broken down because there are multiple socio-economic implications associated with TB as well. And the majority of the brunt is faced by women because these are the most vulnerable sections among these two genders. So if you talk about the first cause, see, you need to understand one formula. If the body is not immune enough or if the immunity of the body is compromised, then it also increases the rate of fatality or the rate of being vulnerable to the attack of this bacteria. So the fatality and the vulnerability increases when the immunity of the body is compromised. Now there are multiple factors which are ultimately the causes of TB in India. The first and the most prevalent reason is the prevalence of poverty in India. Poverty degrades the purchasing capacity or the ability to live in a good standard. So therefore, when somebody is poor, then they probably will be living in more unhygienic accommodations, which will thrive the growth of this bacteria. Second, they will not be able to afford basic facilities like healthcare, which will hinder their cure or their treatment from the TB disease. And this also makes sure, the poverty also makes sure that they are not having the accessibility to the hygienic infrastructure. For example, basic structures like sanitation or clean water, etc. All of this eventually compromises with what? Their immunity, giving the bacteria more chances to thrive in such localities. In fact, it has been said by a report that the slum dwellers and the homeless people specifically of India are 3.5 times more prone to getting the TB disease as compared to the rest population of India. That is the consequence of poverty. Second is malnutrition. What is malnutrition? When body is not properly nutritioned, which means that again body will not be able to fight the infections like TB because it lacks the necessary nutrients required to fight the same. Who suffers from the majority amount of malnutrition in India? It is the women. In fact, 52% of the women in India are anemic. And therefore, government has specifically been running programs for bolstering the nutrition in female and in children in India through Poshan Abhiyan, if you remember. So we talk about women. Women are more prone to malnutrition, and malnutrition causes about 40% of new TB cases each and every year. In fact, according to the National Institute of Research in TB, which is in Chennai, it says that people who have weight less than 35 kgs are 4 times more prone to getting TB as compared to those which are having moderately higher weight. Again, I have talked about women. Why women are more prone to TB? Because they suffer the huge burden of malnutrition in India. Then you talk about the pollution. Pollution basically, or the air pollutants, they irritate the lungs in the body, which also again compromises with the lungs' ability to fight with another disease, which is TB or the TB bacteria. Now, do you know who is unfortunately suffering from the huge amount of air pollutant exposure? It is the rural women of India, who are often working still in chulhas and in chimneys, therefore getting exposed to huge amount of air pollutants like soot, etc. And therefore it further degrades their immunity more. Next is HIV/AIDS. Now, it has been observed by WHO that people who have been suffering from HIV/AIDS, which basically is responsible for drastically reducing the immunity of the body, are highly prone or highly susceptible to getting TB again. And India has third rank in the burden of HIV/TB cases. 39% women in India are actually suffering from HIV. So can you see the amount of gravity women faces when it comes to being vulnerable towards TB? Then, lack of awareness and stigma. Now, these are the main factors which hinders the treatment and also causes psychological traumas in women. First of all, there is lack of awareness about the symptoms of the TB. Therefore, it often gets ignored. Even if somebody has understood the symptom, they don't come out and open in order to because of the fear of social ostracization, because they will be getting isolated socially, or because of the fear that they will be removed from their home. In the cases of women, many of them are led destitutes or homeless. And because there is this huge intrinsic stigma around the contagion or the spreadability of TB disease, therefore, even after knowing, the diagnostics doesn't happen on time, and the treatment, let's not talk about it at all, because again, because the diagnostics are not taking place, treatments are not taking place, and therefore people directly die out of the preventable disease called TB. And this is more for the case of women, where the stigma, the social stigma, is even higher, because anyway they are considered as liability in the society for most of us. And then when it is considered as liability, then when they are already suffering from a contagious disease like TB, you can only imagine what can happen to them. Now, how do you fight TB and also ensure social justice in the society? First of all, the need of the hour is to integrate these lesser spoken topics of gender, of women, and of also integrating situations like homelessness into all the existing schemes of the government programs. So, for example, first of all, we need gender responsive approach. For example, the Health Ministry, along with Central TB Division, has developed a national framework for the year 2029 to introduce a gender responsive approach where they are taking more care of the highly vulnerable sections, for example, the tribal and the women in specific. Then we need to build up a holistic policy, because TB needs a multi-pronged approach. We need to deal with the social factors, the economic factors, and the psychological factors in order to deal with TB. For this, a holistic policy has already came in place in the name of National Strategic Plan for TB Elimination. You can again use this along with the way forward in your mains answers. Then we also need to raise the awareness in order to challenge the existing social stigma regarding the TB disease. First of all, people need to be made aware of the symptoms of TB so that they can properly go and seek the diagnostics. Second, we also need to make sure that the social stigma is beaten around TB so that people reveal themselves to be suffering from this disease and get the treatment at the right time so that it can be cured and doesn't lead to their death. Now, for this, Pradhan Mantri TB Mukt Bharat Abhiyan has been a flagship mission from the government of India to end the TB and to raise awareness for the same. This you can see, TB Harega Bharat or Desh Jeetega is coming from the same Bharat Abhiyan, the awareness campaign from the government of India. Then the social and financial support. This is a very important scheme and it can also be asked in prelims. This is the Nikshay Poshan scheme or the Nikshay Abhiyan, which basically tries to provide financial and social support to the TB patients by giving them 500 rupees directly in their bank accounts. This is for the TB patient. This is to provide them some minimal financial support so that they can they can avail their medicines and their treatments. This is specifically to deal with the poorer and the vulnerable sections of the society, because as you can see that the highest vulnerable sections are the tribal population and the women. So they are supported with financial benefits. At the same time, they are also provided with Nikshay Mitras. Now, Nikshay Mitras are those who provide psychological, logistical, and also medicinal support to the patients who are suffering from TB. And this is more important for women who don't go out because of the lack of accessibility. They don't go out for the diagnostics or to get the proper treatment. So it's better to have doorstep delivery for them. Then in the last, we need to have institutional cares where certain infrastructures are dedicatedly made in order to rehabilitate and to treat the TB patients. And this is specifically important for the destitute and the homeless women. India has already taken step in this regard in the name of TB Care and Counseling Plus centers that have been settled across all the districts of the country. And as a result of this, people who are suffering from homelessness, because of which they are not getting proper diagnostics and cares and treatment, they can also be rehabilitated over here and be taken care of. And this is how we will finally realize the dream of TB Mukt Bharat. Now, our next topic again is a very important one where we'll be reading about the man-wildlife conflict. an emerging topic and has potential to be asked in the mains examination. What is the context? Context is very surprising that Kerala has declared man-animal conflict as the state-specific disaster, making it the first area in the country to take a step like this. So why has man-animal conflict grown to such a menace that it has to be declared as a disaster? First of all, let's understand what do we mean by a man-animal or man-wildlife conflict. So according to the definition that is officially given by the World Wildlife Fund, it basically signifies an interaction between the man and the wildlife which leads to negative impacts on either man, either wildlife, or both of them, or also on the environment in the large. This is what we mean by man-wildlife conflict. Now, it has got implications on both humans and animals. What are the implications on humans? First of all, it leads to loss of life. The carnivores and the huge beasts, for example, elephants, for example, tigers, cheetahs, when they attack on the humans, they take up the life, they cause injury. This has been prevalent in the state of Kerala, because of which they have declared it as a state disaster. This has also been seen in case of Maharashtra, where recently last year, a tiger killed, the very famous case of a tiger killing a farmer happened. Then livelihood loss and property damage can also be caused by these wild beasts, for example, wild boars. So livelihood loss can happen because they can encroach and destroy the agricultural field, and property damage can happen in a similar way. Second, there will also be psychological impacts on the people who are living on the zones which are prone to man-animal conflicts, for example, Western Ghats, Eastern Ghats, Northeastern regions, etc. The psychological impact of stress and fear to be constantly or living in the fear of being attacked by an animal will always be there. So there will be some psychological implications on humans as well. Then it can also lead to some of the zoonotic diseases which are coming from the animals, or the contact between animal and humans. Then what are the impacts on animals? Because it's not just humans who face the brunt of it, but also the animals. Because of the construction of so many infrastructures, for example, the transmission lines, they often face electrocution. This is also seen in the case of the Great Indian Bustard, which actually became critically endangered because of heavy electrocution which happened. And also it is highest in Odisha. This data can also help you in, let's say, mains examination. Then if you talk about the train accidents, they also suffer from train accidents, especially the elephants. And this is also seen highly in the case of Odisha. Then poaching is another reason. When the human and the wildlife inevitably and negatively impact each other. Then in the poaching cases, the rhinos have been poached specifically in Meghalaya, where they have been found to be trawling around the transboundary of Assam and Meghalaya. And then poisoning can also be another impact of their interaction, where animals face the brunt of being poisoned, specifically the wild beast, because they can possibly have implications on humans, so human poison them. So this is also seen largely in the case of Assam. So these are some of the cases where we have shown the implications. Now, what are the causes of man-wildlife conflict that we need to realize? And this is the most important part of discussion. First of all, is the habitat loss and the fragmentation that is happening in their wildlife habitats. So they were living happy hunky-dory. But then we came with our development prospects. We started laying down infrastructure, for example, roads, railways, etc. But what happened? This fragmented their wildlife habitats. Now, some of the species are highly territorial in nature. For example, the cheetahs, the tiger, they need space to move. So they will often encroach upon our area because their areas have been fragmented down. That is the first thing. Second, we often also try to encroach upon the wildlife habitats, for example, and specifically the buffer zones of the wildlife sanctuaries. Why? In order to pursue settlements, in order to pursue agrarian activities. Then, some of the biodiversity threats are also there, which led to the animals moving away from their wildlife habitat. These are the monoculture plantations that happens. For example, eucalyptus plantations, timber plantations have been seen across the roads, specifically in the belt of Narmada. Now, if you go over there, you will see that because there is monoculture plantation or monoculture cropping of one particular species, there is lack of food and fodder for the animals. So they start moving out across the zones in order to search for more variety of foods. Then invasive weeds can also be one of the reasons why their resources, for example, their food, if they are herbivores, or for example, if herbivores are declining, then the carnivore population will also decline. And this will also, the invasive weed species also sometimes try to extract the water resources, so the water also start getting depleted over there. The eucalyptus is a culprit for the same. So invasive weeds, these are some of the biodiversity threats that can lead to man animal conflict, because animals are going out of their zones. Then exceeding carrying capacity, this is also one of the reason. It has been seen in Jim Corbett Park, in the Bandipur National Park. It has been observed that the areas, the national parks, are actually carrying more number of species as it can, or as its resources can support. So therefore, naturally, the beasts or the animals will start moving away from their areas in order to seek more resources. Then prey depletion is also taking place. Prey depletion was one of the reason why at one point of time the Jim Corbett Park saw a depletion in the, because of the depletion in deer population. The Jim Corbett Park also saw the depletion in the tiger population. So this is also one of the reason why, in order to attract or get more number of prey, they start moving out of their zone. As you can see from this data, that many scheduled one species, for example the Indian elephant, the rhinos, the tigers, they are also found to be moving away from their protected areas because of the following causes. Now, then what can be the solutions to the peaceful coexistence of both humans and animals? First of all, we need to manage their habitat. We need to make sure that the buffers are created or corridors are created between the interprotected area migration. This can be seen with the example of Kanha Pench corridor that has been made in the state of Madhya Pradesh, so that it allows free movement of the animals without disturbing or hindering the human settlement. Then we also need to have buffer zone management. As you know, that the wildlife areas or the wildlife sanctuaries are divided broadly into the core area, which is highly protected, and then it has got the buffer zone. Now buffer zone is where people actually start encroaching by laying down their settlements or their crop fields, and this actually leads to, this is the zone which is most prone to man wildlife conflict. So this needs to be managed properly, so that unregulated encroachment doesn't happen over here. Then we need to have habitat restoration program, for example rebuilding our green covers which have been deforested, and this is already taken by the government of India under the Green India mission. Then we need to have certain mitigation measures for the human wildlife conflict. How can we do it? We have to avert the danger before it actually happens by installing some of the early warning systems. For example, installing cameras, installing thermal imaging, installing sensors, so we can track the movement of the wildlife. This is also seen in the case of Project B that we read in the previous Analyst. Project B, that is created by Indian Railways in order to avoid or avert the railway tracks from the elephants. So it alarms the railway masters, railway stations, whenever elephants come across a vicinity of 200 meters from there. So early warning system can be deployed. Second, electric fencing can be made so that the animals can be kept away from the human settlements and the agrarian fields. So this is already seen in the case of Project Lifeline, where a solar-led electric fencing has been done by the WWF in India, in some of the farms of India. Then we can also provide compensation schemes to the victims, the human victims of the animal conflict. So for example, we have got the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, which gives for the reconstruction of the infrastructure or the houses that have been damaged by it. Then we have got Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, which incorporates the losses, the crop losses made because of the animals or destroyed by the animals. They are also insured under this scheme. And there is also an ex gratia compensation which is given within 24 hours to the victim or to the family of the victim suffering from, or who has suffered from, this animal conflict. Now, talking about the community engagement and awareness, awareness is the main thing in order to bring together the social energy. People need to be made aware of the animal behaviors and how to mitigate such attacks and how to behave when an animal attacks them. So awareness program needs to be there. We need to provide proper animal-led education and awareness programs, and we also need to provide diversified livelihood for them. Most of the people are going to these core areas because of lack of any other economic opportunity. They are dependent on the forest resources, therefore they are going to the forest and therefore encountering man wildlife conflict. What we can do instead, we can provide them alternative sources of employment. For example, they can be employed in handicrafts, they can be employed in some other like beekeeping activities. so that they do not overtly be dependent on the forest resources only. And this is how we'll be able to manage a peaceful coexistence between man and wildlife. Now, in the fourth topic, we will analyze the active pharmaceutical ingredients and the performance of API industry in India. In a good news, the context says that the India is set to manufacture penicillin G 3 decades after the last plant shutdown. What is penicillin G? Penicillin, not a term you must have heard in your NCRT, you must have read over there. Anyway, penicillin is an API which is used in antibiotics. And India shut down its plant because of the poor performance of API industry in India and the non-lucrativeness of the same. India has shut down the plant before, but now it is about to manufacture it again after 3 decades. So first of all, let's understand what are these active pharmaceutical ingredients and why are they heavily in use in these times. So when you talk about a drug essentially composes of two components. One is the main vital component of it, which is having some biochemical drug which is responsible for curing the targeted disease. This is known as the active pharmaceutical ingredient. Active pharmaceutical ingredient, as you can see, is only found in some amount, in less than 5% amount. And the rest of the part is known as the excipient. This is the second part of the drug, which is generally made up of some of the receptors which the body can absorb. So in order to take these drugs to the body and increase its absorptiveness in the body, the excipients are used. Let's take the example of crocin tablet, very widely used in India in order to cure fever. The antipyretic or the active ingredient which lowers down the body temperature is known as paracetamol. So when we say that we are taking crocin 650 mg, which means that it has got 650 mg of paracetamol, and the rest part is the excipient, which is generally a starch, which is easily absorbed by the body. So this is the API. The paracetamol is the API. Now, we have understood the two major components of a drug. Now let's understand India's performance in API. So we understood that penicillin is a kind of API, your paracetamol is a kind of API. Now what is India's potential in the terms of API production? In API is intrinsically very important in our pharmaceutical industry, in which India performs very brilliantly. In fact, India exports 20% of the total generic drugs across the world, which also makes it the pharmacy of the world. But it actually performs fairly poor in the production of APIs. So, India is the third largest producer of API, accounting for 8% share of the total API industry. If you talk about worldwide, then you will be able to see that most of it, according to volume, most of it is produced by China. So China stands first and India stands third after Italy in the terms of total volume of production of API. But still we are importing API and many of the API industries have seen shutdown. Why? Because of certain challenges happening. Challenges, first of all, was the cheaper availability of APIs from China. As you can see that it's a bulk producer and it rather provides API in very cheap amounts, which also makes our industry very susceptible to the supply chain disruptions that were also observed in the case of COVID, because China spiked up the prices of API, therefore calling up for a PLI scheme or Atmanirbharta for India for the production of API. So first of all, we are over dependent on China. In fact, about 80% of India's API is coming from China or is coming as in the imported form. So we are again the third largest producer of API, but again the highest or net importer of APIs. Next is the high production cost, which makes it less lucrative for the industries to be set up. Why high production cost? Because of the high raw material cost. The raw material that is required is very, very costly. And also it is again environmental intensive industry, energy intensive industry. Again, it requires many chemicals which are not environmental friendly. So again, it attracts a lot of environmental regulations. So again, the company have to face the brunt and it eventually makes this industry very, very highly capital intensive. So what government has done for the same in order to promote the APIs in India, because we understand that we cannot be reliant on China or other imported countries, because if we want to really realize the dream of being the pharmacy of the world, we need to also dominate on the production of API. And we also need to become from net importer to net exporter. So how do we do that? First of all, by bringing Atmanirbharta by production linked incentive scheme, which was launched in the year 2020 post COVID. So when this happened, It called for incentivizing the incremental sale and also in the manufacturing, attracting the manufacturing and FDI in the production of critical APIs and the key starting materials. So key starting materials are nothing but the raw materials or the raw chemicals which are used in different concentration to produce API. So the first was PLI scheme and second was a bulk production or creation of bulk drug park for bulk production of APIs in India. So it becomes more viable for the industries to produce it. The bulk drug parks were suggested in Himachal Pradesh and Gujarat. So these are some of the schemes that have been taken up by the government of India in order to promote API in the India. So in simple words, El Nino is a weather phenomena which leads to abnormal rise in the sea surface temperature where in the equatorial Pacific Ocean, specifically in the eastern part of the Pacific Ocean, affecting Peru and Ecuador. Now what happens? This is an abnormal condition, right? Abnormal rise in sea surface temperature. So what happens in a normal condition? In a normal condition, what happens? If you understand the playground over here, which is the equatorial Pacific Ocean, you will be able to see two coasts, two sides of it. One is the Australian coast and second is the South American coast. Now in a normal condition, what happens? Typically, because of the equatorial counter current which moves in this direction, which moves from east to west, what happens that there is a development of low pressure in the Australian coast or in the Western Pacific. Because of the further aggravation of this low pressure, what happens here sets the direction, it sets the direction of very strong trade winds which flows from high pressure towards low pressure. So this also establishes a very strong Walker cycle. So a strong Walker cycle, strong trade winds across the world is what happens during a normal condition. And during this normal condition, which coast is having low pressure? Australia coast is having low pressure. Now, whichever coast is having low pressure, this is where the convection currents will start flowing. And this will lead to thunderstorm or rainfall like conditions, leading to rainfall in the Southeast Asian coast and in the Australian coast. What happens alternatively in South America in a normal condition is because you can see that there is replacement or pull off the warm waters, the warm equatorial waters away due to very strong trade winds. So what happens? The underlying nutrient-rich cold current starts upwelling. So this brings rich prospects for the industry over here because it gives them a lot of nutrients in the form of good fishes. So this is a typical normal condition. What happens abnormally sometimes at the frequency of 2 to 10 years. An abnormal conditions called El Nino persists, which again lasts for up to 9 to 12 months. And what happens during this phase is these conditions get altered. These conditions get altered in such a way that now the low pressure will become dominant in the South American coast as compared to the Australian coast. So now you will see the development of high pressure in the Australian coast and development of low pressure condition in the central equatorial Pacific region and in the eastern Pacific region. This is because of the weakening of the trade winds. Now the trade winds which were strong in the normal condition have become weaker. And this is also because of the weakening of the ultimate Walker cell. So the Walker cycle has also weakened down, trade winds weakened down. So now which current has become stronger? The counter equatorial current, which will be carrying all the warm Pacific waters towards the eastern side. As a result, the upwelling will not happen. This will sadden the farmers, this will sadden the fishing industry over there, and this will also cause heavy rainfall in this region of South America. Now, why is this known as El Nino? El Nino is a Latin word for the boy which stands for Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ was born in Christmas. Christmas happens in the month of December, and generally it was seen that it happens across or it reaches its peak during the month of December. It happened in the last year also that the peak were observed from November, December to January 2024. That was the time when the peak was observed. Though this is not a normal cycle that we find, but at the same time it was named after this particular event of Christmas, and that is why this is known as El Nino. Now, how does it impact the monsoon? First of all, you need to understand what happens with the Australian coast in this time, because now it is laden with a high pressure, which means it will also suppress the convective currents which were causing rainfall. Also, what is happening? The weakening of the trade winds. Trade winds are responsible for carrying the mascarene high towards the Tibetan low, which causes the Indian monsoon. So naturally, when there is a weakening of the Walker cycle of the trade winds, it also actually alters the jet streams as well. Because of the weakening of these two factors which facilitate monsoon, it also weakens monsoon, and therefore it causes drought-like condition in the western part of the world, or basically in the Western Pacific region. So this is the impact of monsoon. So as we can see that the event of El Nino is inversely related to Indian monsoon. If the El Nino is at its peak, the Indian monsoon would be at its low, probably reaching drought-like condition. In fact, some of the worst of the droughts India saw were actually coinciding with the El Nino year only, as can be seen in the recent ones, 2002, 2009. In fact, many of the heat waves which killed so many people in India also happened in the last year. Why? Because it was an El Nino year, a very extreme El Nino year. Okay. You also need to remember one more thing from geography point of view, that though El Nino is responsible for droughts in India, not all El Nino years have led to drought. Why? Because they were counterbacked by another event which is known as Indian Ocean Dipole. So in the case of an Indian Ocean dipole, what happens is there is development of an intense low pressure in the case of a positive. There are two types again, positive Indian Ocean dipole which favors the monsoon, and the negative Indian Ocean dipole which doesn't favor. So a positive Indian Ocean dipole, it creates intense low pressure, intensifies the trade wind, and therefore it causes monsoon in this region. Therefore, when Indian Ocean dipole is present, then it also is often seen that the El Nino doesn't really brings drought to the India. Now, what are the impact on Indian economy? Of course, if there is drought, there is less amount of production, and because of the lower production, especially of the most staple crops like rice which are grown in summers, it also decreases the food security of the country, and it also causes losses to the farmer. So it also gravely affects not only the physical, not only the climatic conditions in India, but also the economy of India. And anyway, we know that Indian economy is nothing but a gamble of monsoon. Because it impacts monsoon, it impacts India. So this was all about the discussion on El Nino, IOD in short, and what is its impact on monsoon. So this brings us to the end of the discussion, and before winding up, here's to the strong women of our country. May we know them, may we be them, may we raise them. A very happy International Women's Day to you, and a happy Mahashivratri.